Alright guys, so in this next video I'm going to be talking about a subject called foreshortening, which in drawing, foreshortening is when an object is greatly reduced in scale because your viewpoint is making it recede sharply into space. So like when you hold a hand and you look at your fingers going straight at the camera, the finger itself is foreshortened from your viewpoint. Um, so how would you actually draw, like how do you measure and draw objects that are foreshortened? Because my hand right now is receding into space at a very direct angle to our vantage point. So I'm going to be talking about how, from this vantage point, this object recedes sharply back into space. Also the front is coming forward sharply. From this vantage point, how do we accurately draw that sharp recess into space from for this object? So, by and large, it is the same technique of measuring that we are doing with our sighting. However, you just have to be very sensitive to what you're seeing. Meaning, just like we were doing with the shell and the bottle, with a viewfinder and finding angles, the way that you are able to see the angles that are like this contour here and the contour on the bottom going back, those are going to be really important, and it's going to set up the angle at which the front of the bottle recedes back towards the base. Getting that angle right, the one at the top going back, hitting the base properly, is probably the most important aspect. And just like we were doing with the shell, we can take these points, like where it hits here, near the tape, these points here, and you can measure where does that point, when it recedes into space, the base, where does that point, holding my arm out straight, using my pencil as a horizontal line, where does that point hit, where does that cut across the cap? And then likewise, the point at the bottom where it rests here on the tape, if you take that horizontal across, you can basically make these 2 points here from which then you can start to measure out forward your bottle. So I'm going to start here with drawing the cap. I'm going to do that pretty simply. You can also measure that out. You can do as much measuring as you'd like. I'm going to kind of lay in some of my plumb lines, because I know there's some angles here. Measure the top, find that angle, across just slightly down. So slightly. As wide as it is tall, so let's make sure we really get that proper width. Just going to do some quick hatching, just to lay in that plane, because I think it kind of helps me out. And now when we look at this front face here, you can see that there is a slight change. The width here from the cap to the edge of the face here is slightly smaller than on this side, and you can see that edge of the black cap. From my angle, I can see that side there, and I can't see anything on this side, and that helps to create that illusion, is that only one side is seen. And you can even take your pencil and get somewhat of a handle on that. Just remember, there's nothing, you can't see any of that side of the cap on the other side. You can see that the face here, where does this face hit the cap that the top face of the cap? Where does this face hit the cap? Can't see part because of this hinge here. So I'm just going to put that hinge in. But what does that start to look like? What does that face look like? It's actually very small. When you think about the size, this face, you can just see just a sliver of it, like one of the later early stages of the moon. Like it looks very moon-like, very crescent moon-like. Directional hatching, because it's got some. So you see that the way I've put in that face there on the right side, it's just like a crescent moon shape to set that up. Now we can talk about this circular face here. Like I said, one side is slightly smaller than the other, and that helps to make that illusion. And so we can measure what's the size of our black cap to the size of our face there. So it's not quite 2, it's like 1 1/3. This is very circular. So it's almost a perfect circle around. It's kind of helpful with drawing. However, it's where that cap is sitting on the circle. It's slightly wider on this side than the other. Just really make sure I'm almost drawing that perfect kind of circle around it. Keeping and noticing too that distance here on this face is very similar to that. The only difference really is that this side, the left side, is slightly smaller than the right. So notice how the left side is slightly smaller than the right. The overall width of the circle and the height is 1 1/3 of the cap, because we do that quick measuring where you just quickly measure the cap and then you measure out with the circle. So it's 1 2/3, I should say. Now that we got this front face here, and I haven't done any of the shading yet. I mean, we could, because there's some shading going on the bottom here. See, I'm just doing some quick hatching. I mean, that cap is really dark, and you've got some highlights on it and all that kind of stuff, but it's not really our focus here, is it? Okay, so now, how do we figure out this angle as it recedes back? What is the best way to do that? And for me, like I said, I'm looking at the point where it hits the tape here as a marker, and I'm just flattening. My vision is saying where, if I take my pencil horizontally across the entire bottle, where does that back point where it hits the tape, where does that cut across the face of the cap? It seems to cut across right here, right around the top 1/8 or so of the cap. So sometimes I just put that horizontal. But now, how long is it? How far does it go back? And that could be a pretty. So I'm going to use my cap. I'm going to measure the black cap, and then I'm going to measure between the edge of the face here and the base. So once again, because it's foreshortened, it's going to be really, actually, rather, if you flatten that out, it's actually just, once again, like a crescent moon shape, but it's just elongated slightly because you have to take into account that that's a tall bottle. So we're squashing the height of this bottle into a very small crescent moon-like shape. So I'm going to, once again, measure my black cap, and then I'm going to use that to measure that distance between the edge of the front face and the base here. So what is the size of that sliver compared to the size of the cap? So it's about a third. It's only a third the size of its cap. So if we look at our cap, break it into thirds, it's basically a quarter of an inch. The entire length of that bottle from the front face to the back face is a quarter of an inch. However, remember that that point where it hits that tape cuts across the top of our cap. So now we're just trying to draw the shape of that beige crescent moon that is the squashed height of the cap. Do you see that? This entire length of this cap, because of our vantage point, really is much more closer to the shape of a crescent moon. And so you can see where the other point where it hits the tape at the bottom, if you take a vertical, it doesn't cut across the cap. So we can put a vertical line there. So these are the shapes that are going to help make, but between, so you have to be very sensitive now how we put in that. This comes down, but then the tape overlaps it. Shadow there. So I'm just now drawing just these shapes here. I'm just trying to translate those shapes into my drawing. I may have even made this slightly too big, but that's... So the curve though, we gotta make sure we get this curve right, the way it curves. If you need to, you can even go into your cylinder. So see how I'm really having to go over that line over and over again? If you want to erase to lighten it up, you can. I'm really gonna... So if you don't get it quite right with all your measuring, you can always go back and adjust. That's the whole point. So this, a little sliver of that. So now I'm gonna try to draw the edge of our tape. So we're looking at I'm looking at this edge of the tape. Where does the top of that cut across our bottle? So I'm doing another vertical. Cuts under our cap. So do another vertical there. Just So there are some moments where your measuring will really come in handy, help you out. I think our tape is actually a bit wider than this. So if you see the cardboard and then the tape, so let's adjust that. Notice how I'm totally erasing what I just drew and I'm just adjusting. A bit bigger. And I can see at this outermost point here, where does that, what kind of angle does that make? Pretty close. Got an interesting shadow across here, across the tape. Just gonna put it in right now. Really bright whites over here, so I'm going to really get that bright white. Notice how it's wider here and then it gets thinner there, so we got to make sure we get that in there. And the shape of the shadow, how does that look there? That was pretty good actually. We got a good indication of that circular form here. And we've got some cast shadow. Notice how I'm using different hatch marks here. Pure vertical. It's not quite vertical, the cast shadow. It's not quite vertical. So then what's really interesting is we have this crescent moon kind of shape with the tape here, and we have a much, much smaller little sliver of darkness on the other side of the cap. So dark over here, so you just lay that in there. It sets the shadow for your tape. Once again, we've got some interesting bright white kind of stuff. So now you're just kind of following the circular shape of the tape. I'm just going to kind of put that in there. So it's really important here when we look at foreshortened objects to see how what we think we see, most of this drawing has been made up of crescent moon shapes, and the way that this bottle here the length of it falls and becomes more of these crescent moon shapes. How on one side is a smaller size than the other, and as it goes back, that the base here is actually much, much smaller than the height of the front face. That's the main thing, is that you find these angles. I found them by seeing where the bottle hits across the tape, but then you can just look at the shape of the bottle. It's very organic in terms as it goes back. The base is always smaller than the top in kind of foreshortened drawings like this. So it's a combination of finding the angles, but also just looking at the shape that that bottle makes in relation to the other object. It's not a bad drawing. I could keep shading, but it's really about, it's hard to see those angles at first. You have to really be able to see the shape that it makes and then what other points it hits with the other objects. It'll really help you to get a handle on the shape of that object. Really darken our cap. So, not bad.